Okay, class, so I welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today, we are going to look on toward a major mechanism that we see in case of the eye, and that would be the pupil reflex. And what do we mean by the pupil reflexes? Like if you remember from the previous classes, what we know is that at the center of the eye we have got this opening, and this opening is the pupil with us, and this pupil actually has to regulate that how much of the amount of the light would be entering into the eye or no, and for that purpose the size of this pupil has to be controlled. And I have told you also that the size of the pupil is actually controlled by the muscles that we have in the second layer of the eye, and that was iris with us. So you see that this pupil is clearly aligned by the iris muscles, and these iris they actually have a contribution in controlling the size of this pupil. So if I were to be showing you another diagram, so you see that in the eye we have got this choroid, and here we have the ciliary body, and here we have this iris coming up with us. And these irises, they basically have got this central opening, and this is pupil. So we would see now that how come this iris muscles that we have, they would be regulating the size or the diameter of this pupil that we have got. So if I were to talk about the role of the iris, so the situation has got very simple now, that this would control the amount of the light that would pass through an opening in it, and that opening is the pupil with us. And we say is that this pupil that we have in the center of the eye, so this has an ability to be getting dilated and an ability to be getting constricted. So by the dilation, what I mean is that this pupil, by the help of the iris muscle, this was increased in diameter, and when this would increase in diameter, more amount of the light would enter. The same iris muscles, they can also cause this pupil to be constricting or becoming narrower. So when the size of the pupil would become narrower, or when this would constrict, then ultimately less amount of the light would enter. So if I were to take you to the daily life situation, so whenever you people are there in a dim light, so these iris would make the pupil dilated. And in case if you were there in some kind of the bright light, so we would not want any of the excess light to enter. So this iris muscles, they would cause the pupil to constrict. And what we say is that this ability of the pupil, whereby this is dilating and constricting, so this is what we refer to this as the pupil reflex, we say. Now, here is another diagram coming up when you people are there in the dim light. So the size that we have for the pupil, you see that this is increasing, and when we are there in the bright light, so the size of the pupil is decreasing. This is constricting. In the dim light, more amount of the light would be allowed to enter into the eye, and in bright light, less amount of the light would be allowed to enter into the eye. So this dilation thing and constriction thing that we see in the people simultaneously happening. So this is referred to as the pupil reflex, we say. Now, since I have said that the pupil have an ability to dilate and constrict, and that is due to the muscles of the iris that we have in the choroid, and they were present anteriorly. So in the iris, what we have to understand further is that iris further has got two bands of the muscle. One would be the circular muscles in it, and then the other one would be the radial muscles in it. And this circular and the radial muscles that we have with us, so collectively we call them as antagonistic pair of the muscles, because the situation would be that when these circular muscles they would contract, so the radial muscles would relax, and when the radial muscles would contract, the circular muscles would relax. So such kind of a association that happens between the muscles. So we call this as antagonism, or we refer such muscles as antagonistic pair of the muscles. Now, if I were to be showing you what how these muscles they are arranged, so you see that from the front of the eye, this was a pupil, and this entire structure was the iris with us. So in the iris, the muscles that are arranged in a circular manner, so they are the circular muscles, and the muscles that are arranged just like the spokes of the bicycle tire. So these are referred to as the radial muscles, we say. Now, what we have to be understanding here is that what would be the mechanism of the iris in controlling the size of the pupil when the bright light would fall. As I have explained below, that when your eyes are exposed to the bright light, so the size of the pupil that we have here, this has to constrict. So what I do is I tell my students this formula. Now, this formula at any cost, you are not required to be writing an exam, but this is for your understanding. Like I have got this C square and R square. The first C would stand for circular, the other C would stand for the contract, and the R square, one R would stand for the radial, and the other R would stand for the relax. So whenever you have to be constricting the pupil when exposed to the bright light, you would say that the circular muscles of the iris they would contract and the radial muscles of the eye they would relax for us. Now, if you were to see this diagram further and an explanation written in here as well, so here you see we have this pupil at the center, and if you were to see further, so we have got these circular muscles, and then these muscles that we have, they are the radial muscles. So for the explanation in the exam, you would say that initially when the bright light would hit your eye, so this would initially be detected, and then afterward the radial muscles that we have they would relax and the circular muscles would contract, the pupil would constrict, and the size of or the diameter of the pupil it would narrow down, and as a result of that the less amount of the light it would enter into your eyes. Now if I were to further proceed and if we were to look at what would happen when the dim light would hit your eyes, so when the dim light is hitting our eyes, then the iris must be increasing the diameter of the pupil, because since we are in the dim light, so we would want more light to enter. So our vision in the dim light should be more. So this is the same formula as I have with me as of above. So now you would be cross multiplying them. So you would say that the circular muscles, now in this case, they would relax and the radial muscles, they would contract. And as a result of that, the size of the pupil would increase and more amount of the light would enter into your eyes. Now, if I were to show you a neat diagram of this, so you see that in the dim light, the size of the pupil is increasing. Now, when we were exposed to the bright light, so the size of the pupil was decreasing. But here, in this example, this is actually increasing. Again, what you are required to be remembering for your exam is that again, when you are there in the dim light, so the photoreceptor that we have in the eye, so they would detect that the environment you are exposed to is now dark or having the dim light. So now the radial muscles would contract and the circular muscles would relax and the pupil would dilate, it would increase its diameter. And as a result of that, more amount of the light would enter into your eyes. So I hope you would be very much clear with understanding that how come the pupil reflex that we have in the eye, so this would be accomplished with an intention to or when in an exposure to the dim light or the bright light.